Welcome back from the networking lunch. This is what happens when you meet so many people from different countries meet with each other. Things happen. And I'm proud to announce that the Arctic Parliamentary Network is in the making in these days, these minutes. We just met at lunch, separate lunch, back in the Friendship Hall. And the aim for Arctic Parliamentary Network is to meet each time there's an Arctic Circle conference somewhere in the world. So parliamentarians and other elected officials can network, talk about the Arctic issue, and of course be more active in their own parliaments and municipalities. So I would like you to give a little hand to our parliamentarians and elected officials for this. And now to continue with the program, Pernille Bengtsson, she is going to introduce this session. And she is from the Industry, Labor and Trade and Foreign Affairs with Government of Greenland. Let's go.
Thank you very much. I hope you all had a very good lunch and a good opportunity to network. I'm very pleased to present to you this very next session, which is about the future of Arctic business. I am pleased to present the speakers of the panel. And today we have, first of all, Honorable Minister Vitus Qujaukitsoq. He's the Minister of Industry, Labor, Trade and Foreign Affairs, Government of Greenland. Secondly, we have Klaus Møller. He's the Head of Energy Division for Siemens. Welcome. And then we have John Mayer, Managing Director, Greenland Minerals and Energy. We have Heidar Gunnjónsson, Chairman for Aecon Energy. And then Niels Andreas Masvi, VP for DNV GL Group. And then Rachel Lorna Johnston, Professor at University of Akureyri and University of Greenland. And then Alexander Shestakov for the World Wildlife Foundation, Director for the Arctic Program. And then finally, Jon Palmason, engineer for Verkis. So thank you very much for coming here today, and we look forward to a very good session. First of all, I would like to ask the Minister to open the session with a few words. Thank you.
Thank you. As you all know, the ice in the Arctic Ocean is melting, and it poses new challenges, but also new opportunities for Greenland. If you look at the chart, the square kilometers of the Arctic ice has been depleting for the past few decades, and it continues to melt. It poses new opportunities as it has been presented by the previous sessions. For Greenland, this is an opportunity in regards to the natural resources and the living resources and the biological resources that the Greenland has abundance of. If we look at the most advanced mineral projects, we have a few projects that we like to share with you today. First is the iron ore deposit in Isukesia in the Nuuk, near Nuuk. It presents a considerable iron ore with more than 1 billion tons of iron ore. And we gave an exploitation license in October 2013. And there has been agreed an impact benefit agreement in the summer of 2016. There is True North Gems in Apperutuk, a mine that is starting its production this summer, producing world-class ruby and sapphires. It lays about 100 kilometers due south of Nuuk. Then we have the Hudson Resources project of anorthosite, which lays in the Kangerlussuaq Fjord. The mine is starting this summer and is estimating to produce up to 0.5 million tons of anorthosite every year. If we look at the proposed mining projects, then we have the Ironbark Zinc Limited, which lays in Citronen Fjord in the far north, a zinc and lead project, which has an estimated capex of $430 million, and the ore is estimated to be between 70 to 132 million tons, and the production is estimated to last in 14 years. Then we have the rare earth elements in South Greenland, which also contains uranium, a multi-element project in the Kvanefjeld, which is the first one, and the second one is Tanbreeze project, which also lays just across the Kvanefjeld. I think John Mayer is going to present his project himself. Besides water and ice, we have one of the largest freshwater deposits in the world, and Greenland possesses the second largest resource besides Antarctica. And we have granted a few licenses giving grants to produce water for bottled water in Qaqortoq, near Nuuk, and in South Greenland. We have enormous hydropower potential across the entire Greenland due to the fjords and the high-laying lakes that we have across Greenland. We anticipate that the hydropower potentials will be utilized in the future. We have currently 5 hydropower plants, and we are planning to extend with additional 2 plants in the coming years. And for the industrial purpose, we anticipate that there might be up to 3 hydropower plants to be used besides the several-use hydropower potential that we have. We have enormous enzymes and genetic resources that we have plenty of, but I think it's enough to give you a few clues of the natural resources that are more advanced. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Minister. And now for the next speaker, Klaus Møller, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers here for inviting me and with me the company Siemens. Siemens is, as many may not be real aware of, actually an Arctic company, I would state. We have been active in the Arctic countries like Canada, the United States, Russia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and also here in Greenland for more than 100 years. Siemens is a very old company, and the foundation of this company is really to build infrastructure. So why is it important, and why do I think I was invited here today, was really to talk about what we see as necessary prerequisites to build up an industrialization. What does it need? What does it take? I have to get this one working. This is precisely a slide that I would have used has it been in Central Europe or parts of the US. As you can see, the pictures does not match what we have been talking about here the last 2 days of the prerequisites for the Arctics or for the solution needs for the Arctics. The first item up to the left is a working environment. This basically means that you have to make a picture of what kind of working places do you want to create, what is needed for people to move there, to get a job, and what kinds of jobs will there be. So in this case, there is for the Greenlandic challenges, it means fishing, it means tourism, and what we are going to discuss here today, minerals. So this is what I will try to stress on in this presentation here. The second picture you see is all about education. Yesterday we had some interesting views on what is needed to build up education locally, to inspire the youth to get educated and to help to get the society to a next level. Education is also vital very early in the development to find out what is needed and which education do we prioritize. You cannot do everything at one single time. The third bullet is what everyone hopes for, is that larger cities could be built, for instance, of tourism. For tourism most often comes where the nature is very beautiful, where there are hotels, as we had in the previous session, and where there are surroundings that makes it nice to visit there. This means also easy to travel there. That was in the previous session here discussed on the aviation. Larger cities is also a question of inhabitants. And being here 2 days now, I've got it's circled a bit about how many inhabitants do we have in the Arctic region. And if you want to talk growth, you need a lot of inhabitants. So larger cities is simply a necessity. And of course, then we have the whole items of households. Which picture should we put in here for an Arctic household? How should it look? It's not likely that it look like I've shown that on the photo here. And then with people inside, we also have to care about them. This means then if we are going to build up an industrialized society, we then also need healthcare and medical care. So in the infrastructure we want to create, we have to have healthcare as one of the major items in there in order to obtain a sustainable life. And most people here on Earth do want, if it's tourism or if it's the inhabitants themselves, want to be entertained. So also the entertainment has to be incalculated in building up such a society. And then, of course, mobility. I don't expect that many railroads in the Arctic region, actually. So also this photo would not shoot here. We saw in the discussions yesterday that harbors are needed, bigger harbors. We saw also bigger airports is needed, and the infrastructure that goes with good mobility. And last but not least, this is what I'm going to talk about now. For all this, you definitely need energy supply, a sufficient energy supply, and for the Arctic region based on renewable energy. So the energy supply is needed and is basic for this development as we see it, for improving the fishing, for improving the minerals, and to create more tourism into your region. What challenges is there about it, of course? Yeah, what's need to be solved? First of all, it needs money, and who's going to invest, and how to finance it. Who will finance it, and if you finance your energy infrastructure, what problems may arise in it if it's based on renewable energy and if it's based on fluctuating demand, meaning that there is not always the same load in the grid or in the energy network itself. So that's why we in Siemens has introduced this concept power from day one, where we would like to take care of it and then mutually explore it so that you eventually are based on renewable energy if that's needed. We see this as, and this might become a bit technical, I apologize, but it's not easy to show it otherwise. For the Arctic region, we see you have to have a multiple supply. You will have to have, as you have it today, based on hydropower, and you will have also a basic need for storage. Storage in terms of heat for the cities where you have infrastructure and district heating. And we can also say that you have the possibility here to build in photovoltaics. The photovoltaics are very interesting in all the energy world of today. You will see it in the US and in bigger networks worldwide. The integration of photovoltaics also gives the biggest challenges going forward, because the radiation into the photovoltaics only happens when the sun shines. As you can see on the green at the bottom of this line, Greenland has possibility to photovoltaics, as curious it may seem to you, but there is possibility also for you to use it. And then, of course, you have the possibility for wind power. You have tested the first mills, I've learned. And all this should then, whatever you decide, in those microgrids or bigger grids that you have to build, should then have the possibility to have the gas-fired power plants to secure a constant load into the network, to secure that your networks is stable, and if you have industries that they can rely on the power supply. Without power supply, there will be no production. So what I try to show on the lower side of this graph is actually that if you see the orange line, this is the PV generation over a typical day here in Greenland, and then how the load profiles will be over a 24-hour period. So there are some busy constraints in such a network that has to be solved. That's not easy. Has it been done somewhere else in the world? Yes, definitely. We have tried it out now in the Scandic region, where the politician decided to take away fossil-powered power plants in order to reduce the emission of CO2. This gives us, especially in Denmark now, a 55% production of wind energy into the network. And this cost us a lot of new solutions to be found in order to make the grid stable. I will, on the next slide, only show you a very few of those issues. The first of them is that variable generation is not easy to handle, as I mentioned. The wind power is only generated when the wind blows, when the sun shines, and the capacity and the consumers are not aware of it. So you have to build up a systematic where you can cope with these items. And there's also some technical issues about the frequencies in the network that has to be solved. And last but not least, you have to have a mature way of handling these issues, also in terms of payment from the consumers. Siemens has over the years built many such systems, and a proven way for us is to do it in the following, as showed here in the following graph. It might also be a bit busy, but it's actually how we see it. So projects follow always and should always follow such a project line as I described it up here, where you're very aware of what problems do you want to achieve with this network, who's to decide how it should be built, political-wise, should it be based on renewable energy all over or in southern parts, how should a backup system look like, how should it be implemented. And then you, of course, also have some design freezes in your system where you try to describe the processes as it goes along. And you have to find partners that understand the whole system and the issues in the system. And this is the approach that we want to do here for the Arctic region. If such systems should be built, we will be more than happy to leverage on the expertise we had with several such systems around the world, also with local EPCs that want to join with us in order, and then also helping on the financing part of such a system in order to meet the goals set up in the very beginning of such a project. We have now, and I think some of the other speakers will come back to that, been looking into how can we, out of hydropower, generate sufficient energy for a mine production here in Greenland. And how can we secure that this network will also produce energy in the years to come when the mining industry hopefully take off and needs more power. What is needed here is also that we are in a position where we can guarantee the output. So we stand behind our calculations and we can guarantee also that this will be the result of such a project. Typical time for such a project comes from 2 to 3 years. I heard my first bell, I have to. So what I see here is that there's a lot of opportunities being here 2 days with you. So I'm really here to say we want to help. We want to give you the expertise of 380,000 people worldwide, our employees. Not all of them have worked with these topics, but many of them has. And we want to cooperate with you on if it's exploring the fishing industry, is exploring the minerals as we have in the session today, or help with you with building an infrastructure that is attractive for tourism. If you have any questions here after the speak, I will be happy to introduce you to Carsten and to Bent Heuser, who is here also among the participants. So if you have any questions, please contact us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we'll move along speedily to the next speaker, and I'll remind you to be brief so that we can stick to time. We have a lot of speakers. Thank you. This is John Mayer from Greenland Minerals and Energy. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank the organisers very much for the opportunity to participate in what is a very special event and really provide some insights from a representative of the mining industry to both the challenges and the opportunities associated with developing natural resource projects in Greenland. In recent years, there's been a big focus on resources in the Arctic. This is both metals, it's hydrocarbons, it's an area that's become under increasing attention. And Greenland has been, I guess, centre to that process. And importantly, the Arctic region has been a place where mining has taken place for a long time. In fact, some of the world's most famous mines are located within the Arctic region. The Norilsk region in northern Russia is arguably the world's most important nickel resource and contributor to that particular commodity. We see in northern Alaska, the Red Dog zinc mine is the world's most important zinc mine. And Greenland has huge mineral wealth. And mining isn't new in Greenland, but it's receiving new attention. And over the last 10 years, we've seen Greenland's profile grow considerably in the international community. And this coincides with the opening up of Arctic shipping lanes. And this is important. It increases Greenland's connectivity to the world, and particularly to the Asia-Pacific markets, which are where the large industrial countries and economies are located today. And these are major consumers of raw materials, and so essentially important customers to future mining ventures in Greenland. Now, Greenland itself obviously extends from near the North Pole to well outside the Arctic Circle, so a considerable geographic coverage. And so within that we have, I guess, different challenges. But certainly in the south, we see an area that with increased warmth, increased accessibility, becomes an opportune point for natural resource development and new mining opportunities. Over the last 10 years, there's been a very big spend, if you like, in terms of exploration and development for natural resources in Greenland. And in parallel to this, we've seen Greenland's profile grow immensely in coverage from National Geographic to a variety of media outlets, to documentaries, and to news forums. And through that process, we've seen well over $500 million US, probably closer to $1 billion, invested in evaluating, identifying, and exploring opportunities. And through that, we have a whole raft of new mining ventures. Some of them Minister Vidas has touched on, and that continues. The pipeline of projects continues to grow. So Greenland has had a very successful 10 years in which its profile and a footprint is now laid for the next step. In parallel to this, we've seen major advances in Greenland's regulatory framework, Greenland's Mining Act, taking on board the structure and the function of mining policy in some of the more sophisticated mining jurisdictions in the world. We look at Canada, we look at Australia. Greenland also stands to benefit from other mining ventures in the Arctic region, learn from the experience, and so we can employ best practice here in Greenland for future development. So the next challenge for Greenland, the next step, which is already underway, is to convert this investment into successful development of natural resource opportunities in a sustainable manner for the long-term benefit of Greenlandic society. A big part of this is no doubt brings challenges to the program. Some of those challenges extend from local community level to the top level of politics and the interface at an international level. But what's really important is development of the Greenland brand, a concept that we refer to as what does Greenland represent in the international investment community? Because Greenland, while it has a very stable backdrop, does not necessarily have a big precedent for successful foreign investment in large ventures. And so because of this, we have to work particularly cooperatively to generate a clear, stable platform upon which foreign investment can be secured to successfully see projects developed. This involves management of stakeholder interests across a considerable and diverse array of stakeholders, and obviously a very close look at environmental considerations. It involves integration with local communities to understand what's important in order to achieve long-term benefit. A big challenge for Greenland has been the infrastructure gap, and I think it's very relevant. The former speaker touched on the concept of introducing infrastructure, particularly power, to help reduce that infrastructure gap. And that infrastructure gap is a big cost gap, if you like, between Greenland and other parts of the world. And it's essential that we build that gap, build that bridge, such that the cost structure of projects in Greenland can be competitive and compete in what is a very competitive international business, and that is natural resource supply. So increasingly there's awareness of this. There is a great opportunity for service providers, industrial service providers, in terms of port facilities and operation, in terms of power provision, to help bridge the gap through mechanisms such as public-private partnerships to help make Greenland more cost competitive and to ensure foreign investment can be secured. Of course, clear rules and regulations and consistency in policy are all important to demonstrate a stable platform for investment and growth. For Greenland, it's very important to focus on the advantages in order to be able to compete in the international marketplace. And Greenland does have advantages. Because of the ice cap, it's only really the coastal fringe of Greenland that is a point of focus for mineral exploration and mineral development. That means in a lot of areas you have direct shipping access. Now in Australia, where I come from, you'll often see mines thousands of kilometres, certainly hundreds of kilometres from the coast. In Greenland, the proximity to port facilities, new port facilities may be required, but this is highly advantageous. There's also the potential for hydropower. We've just heard from the previous speaker about the opportunities, and this is very important for the long term. Not only is it a stable, cost-effective source of power, it avoids a carbon footprint, which is increasingly important in today's world moving forward. We have a proactive and supportive administration in Greenland that is out engaging in different forums internationally to promote the Greenland Framework, the Minerals Act, and the opportunities. And we have a stable backdrop. These are all very important in successfully developing mining opportunities. For the best part of 10 years, our company, Greenland Minerals and Energy, has been involved in evaluating the Kvanefjeld project in South Greenland. It's considered amongst the resource and investment community as a world-class opportunity, and that's largely due to a series of unique attributes that allow for a long-life, internationally competitive operation, set to produce metals that are fundamentally important to clean and efficient energy use. So building blocks, if you like, for an energy-efficient future. The highest environmental standards must be met and benefits must be clear in order for the opportunity to proceed. And what are the benefits? Well, the benefits are jobs. The benefits are opportunity. The benefits are stimulus for local communities, for local businesses. And with every successful project development in Greenland, the profile grows and the Greenland brand consolidates and becomes stronger and helps to secure ongoing investment in Greenland, and so the process progresses. But it's important to acknowledge that these processes do not happen overnight. Companies need to understand that these are long-term projects, long-term investments. In our case, it's been the best part of 10 years, 60 to 70 million US dollars worth of investment to evaluate an opportunity. And that's even before you start the permitting process. So it requires an incredible level of cooperation, a lot of communication, in order to actually progress and move ultimately towards successful development. And this just touches on the diversity and cross-section of stakeholders that all have something to contribute and that are all involved in the program. This extends from governments, in this case primarily the Greenland government, but also the Danish government, customers, media, non-government organisations, local communities, financiers, owners, international policy and conventions. It's a very diverse mix, and they all have to be considered and ultimately integrated successfully. In our case, we've had to make sure that we communicate a lot of things that have been new to local communities in Greenland. The steps involved in developing and evaluating projects. This includes understanding environmental studies. What kind of jobs are involved? We're looking at environmental work. We're looking at technical work. We're looking at marketing work. We're looking at health and safety. Mining is a very, very diverse business and presents a lot of opportunities and requires a lot of support from outside businesses. So this comes about, we've provided initiatives such as Open Days with groups, consultants to provide insight. We've been able to work with the mining school, put on traineeships to help understand the programs, the opportunities and the processes involved in taking a project successfully through the evaluation and into mine development. So just to wrap up, I think based on our experience in Greenland, we've seen huge progress in the last 10 years, and that gives us confidence that the challenges ahead can be overcome. The needs of stakeholders can be met, and we can successfully see projects develop to the benefit of Greenland society. And in the case of the Kvanefjeld project, the aim is straightforward: to develop a sustainable long-term new source of metals, materials that are essential to new technologies and energy efficient applications, but done to the benefit, the long-term benefit of Greenland society. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any discussion after the session's finished.
Thank you for that presentation, John Mayer. And now moving on to Heidar Gunnjónsson from Acorn Energy, please.
Yes, moderator, Mr. President, ministers, ladies and gentlemen. I'm especially happy to be here with you today. I've had a long-standing sort of relationship with Greenland. My talk is going to be mostly concerned with best practices, how to guarantee that those who come here in order to take on big developments always follow the best handbook available on how to do this in a sustainable manner, in accordance with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, in harmony with the environment, and in good cooperation with the locals. But first, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit and what awoke my interest in Greenland. I'm born in Iceland, and I'm Icelandic, but what basically took me for the first time to Greenland was not something that I heard in Iceland. I was actually working in New York on Wall Street, and there my friends were eager to ski somewhere exotic. And they said, well, why don't we ski in Greenland? And we started thinking about it. These were former professional skiers. They had competed in Olympics, won medals, but they weren't really sure how to maneuver on ice or how to survive on a glacier. So they thought I would be a local sort of partner to take along, knowing everything about this. But in reality, I had never really given much thought to Greenland, and I had never thought about skiing there, but Their ambitions were high. They said, well, there's a big peak in Greenland called Gunnbjörn, and nobody has ever skied it, so we should go there. But like in all sort of expeditions, you have to tread carefully. You have to take one step at a time. So what we decided to do was to first do an experimental trip to Tokotormit. And there we went with the polar bear hunters on their sleds with all their equipment into the glacier and stayed there for 2 weeks. But of course we found out that this exploratory trip was highly prudent because my friends from New York, when I had sent them an equipment list of what to bring, they brought what they thought was the right thing. For instance, they would bring yoga mattresses instead of insulation mattresses and things in that manner. So when I looked into the tents, I was sleeping next to one in a tent, and the day after he started to try to get out, he was like this far below myself. He had sunk well into the ground and was freezing cold. We went on another exploratory trip, and we were all totally fascinated by the country. And finally, in 2006, we were able to ski Gunnbjörn. And that was a challenging expedition, but went very well. After that, my friends in Iceland have given me a nickname, and I'm called the Greenlander. Because I'm the one there in our sort of group of friends that I'm the only one that have been here. But what I'm doing, basically, is that I have a very keen interest in the Arctic, and I have a business background, and I work in oil exploration. So I'm the chairman of an Icelandic-Norwegian oil exploration company. And we're doing oil exploration east of Iceland with, for instance, Petoro, the Norwegian state oil company, and CNOOC, the Chinese national offshore oil company. And what I wanted to mention here is that international cooperation is essential. We can see that in the history of Greenland, and we can see it clearly in the history of Iceland. Just prior to this session, there was a gentleman from Air Greenland going through how that good company was established back in the days. It was through a cooperation with SAS and some international investors. But how do you guarantee that there is a favorable outcome of a collaboration like this? How do you guarantee that there's a transfer of knowledge so that the locals will always participate, the locals will benefit, and there will be a new industry that comes out of this collaboration? If we look, for instance, towards Iceland, the fishing sector in Iceland is quite developed, but it wasn't like that 100 years ago. There were basically Scottish brothers that came to Hafnarfjörður, close to Reykjavik, and with their international trawlers. Icelanders had been using boats with oars and had never been able to use trawls. So the Icelanders learned the tricks from the Scots and eventually were able to buy their own trawlers and foster a new, very competitive industry. The same holds true for hydropower generation in Iceland. There were Swedish engineers and Swedish construction companies that came to Iceland, hired locals to help them out, and out of that came a new industry, a knowledge industry in the power sector. What we're hoping, of course, to achieve in Iceland now with the oil exploration is that this transfer of knowledge takes place once more, and we can be a real force in servicing and operating within a new industry. But why are these industries important? And why is it important to have many different industries? We all know that in order to attain international living standards, we need to be able to export. We need to export in order to be able to import. So to have international living standards, we have to have a good business relationship with the international companies, the international business community. And in order not to be too contingent or too dependent on one industry, one export, we need to diversify. So the oil industry in Iceland could actually become the fourth pillar of the economy if things go as planned. Here in Greenland, you have amazing opportunities. But as I said with my ski story before, one has to tread carefully, one has to go and do things step by step, not try to make giant leaps, but take careful steps one at a time. So what I wanted to show you is something that very good people, a good group of different people have been working on now for almost 2 years. It's called the Arctic Investment Protocol. And so basically it's quite simple. It came about in such a manner that there were interest groups, people that have both direct interests and also just curious interests in the Arctic that sat around. These were people, scientists, environmentalists, businesses, indigenous people, and others. And they thought to themselves, how can we guarantee that future developments will be handled in the best possible manner? They drew, of course, on previous work that had been done by the United Nations, like the Sustainable Development Goals that have been set there, but also came up with a more sort of local take on things. So I'm not going to read through these 6 points, but what I think they sort of crystallize very well is that there is a huge need for a local participation in big developments. We need to guarantee that this transfer of knowledge that I mentioned earlier takes place. With that, we can create a more diversified economy, a more interesting economy, because we have to face it in global competition. The biggest competition is not for money or ideas, it's for people. So to attract the best people, to keep the best people, to be able to use the talents of our own population, we need to have a diversified economy that's developing constantly. So I'm going to leave you with that and look forward to the discussions later on. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those words. I'm happy to present Niels Masvik from DNV GL Group. There you go.
Thank you very much, Minister, Chair. DNV GL Group is very proud to be invited by President Grimson and Premier Kielsen to this event, and I must congratulate you also with putting together an extremely interesting, inspiring group of speakers. I hope not to let you down too far. I have been inspired by what I've heard thus far, and I will just follow up on what Gudjonsen mentioned, that if we are going further into the Arctic, let's do it in a stepwise approach, and we can learn from what we have done in the past. I would like to share some ideas about what our company, the DNV GL Group, established in 1864. What we think about are some of the technology challenges and some of the risks around hydrocarbon production and transportation in the Arctic. And I don't think we have to spend a lot of time to remind each other that the Arctic is creating a lot of interest for the fisheries, for the maritime new transportation routes, for the tourism. But there are also significant resources of hydrocarbons. So the hydrocarbons is attracting interest. And even though there could be some individual setbacks in some individual parts of the Arctic, that does not mean that the Arctic is not still a hydrocarbon-rich region. Okay. There are issues around any industrial activity in the Arctic as it is with the hydrocarbon activities. And one is regarding the impact. To what extent can we do it without creating too much or unacceptable negative impact on the people and on the nature where operations are going to take place. But I think we have also heard today that employment, economic growth is also a tremendous value that we have to take into consideration. So industrial activities create values as well, and let's see how we can harvest that in a good way. Secondly, we also have a data challenge, a knowledge challenge in the Arctic. We do have a lot of knowledge, we do have a lot of data, but we don't have enough. So that's why the stepwise approach has to be taken so that we can gather and accumulate data and experience as we move forward. For those of you who are interested in the oil price, you might have noticed that the interest of the Arctic in the oil and gas area has lost a little bit of interest lately, primarily because of the lifting cost you have in the Arctic. So when you have a $40 price environment, the Arctic might look less competitive. However, with the oil price now moving up to 50, we also have to remember that the Arctic hydrocarbons does not come to market with some kind of premium certificate that this is Arctic oil. Because of that reason, it should fetch a premium. It will have to compete. It will have to compete with any oil from everywhere. But that's also the beauty of it, because you could easily see that there are hydrocarbons in the Arctic that can compete in the current price environment. Onshore fields can be relatively safely produced with existing technologies, existing standards. That's why they are relatively cheap to produce. Offshore fields need technology qualification and risk assessment to a much larger degree in order to be acceptable. And we see that some of the Arctic fields, most of them will need the same risk assessment technology qualification approaches to come forward. But we also see that in the Arctic there will be some fields that are not yet economically feasible or technologically accessible. The onshore fields today are pretty much in the remit, under the control of national oil companies, and they're not quickly giving that right away, which means that for those countries where you have difficult offshore fields or difficult to access Arctic fields, you have something to offer international oil companies, because international oil companies now don't have easy access to the onshore fields. International oil companies have the technology, and they have the finances, and they have the experience to handle difficult projects. Okay, we also don't have to remind each other that Arctic is not one place with one similar operational environment. And even two places with an equal distance to the North Pole would have vastly different operational challenges in terms of temperature, in terms of precipitation, in terms of ice conditions, which is why we always recommend, before you broadly write off the Arctic or before you broadly open up the Arctic, look into the individual challenges, the individual issues that you have on your field, and then decide whether this is a field where you can go forward. And the Arctic nations, they have their parliaments, they have their governments, they have their electorate, which ultimately establishes the risk acceptance level. What is the tolerable risk for operating in our waters? What do we think is okay to do in our national waters? And if you think that a risk should be zero, none of you would be here today, because when you took a taxi, when you took the plane, when you walked the street, you took a calculated risk to move with the fear of accident in traffic, fear of accident in air, because you think that risk is acceptable. So society also makes decisions about what we think is acceptable around oil and gas operations. And when we see the Arctic, we don't think in our company that the likelihood of problems in the Arctic are higher, but we think that the consequence will be more dire. We think the consequences will be more difficult. So if we make this in a simpler matrix, if we say that current oil and gas activities are acceptable in the traditional balloon here, you have a frequency picture and you have a consequence picture. If you move the operation into Arctic area, we don't think that the consequence, or sorry, the likelihood of the frequency of that accident will go up, but we think that the consequence will be more difficult. Search and rescue is a completely different issue when it's pitch dark and when the temperature is low than when you have a warmer temperature and when you have light. Search and rescue is much easier if you are close to infrastructure than if you are far from the infrastructure. So in other words, the risk picture in the Arctic changes because the consequence side of your operation is affected. So to bring Arctic operations down to a risk level that is still acceptable, we need to look at the standards and the technologies so that we bring the likelihood of accidents, the frequency of incidents, down to a level that is so low that we can agree that this is something that is an acceptable operation. There are two ways for governments to go about this issue, how to regulate how companies bring the safety back to an acceptable level. And we call those two typical approaches for the prescriptive safety approach or the performance-based safety approach. So my comments now will be on the offshore oil and gas safety regulatory side. I don't comment on the mining industry or the fishery industry. I'm just commenting on the oil and gas industry. So a prescriptive approach gives the detailed instruction how to do it, while a performance-based approach basically gives the companies freedom to handle it the way you need. If we rank this today, we consider the Russian and the American system going in the prescriptive direction, and we view Greenland, Norway, and Canada as a performance-based approaches. And since the Arctic will have new challenges, we strongly recommend that the performance-based approach is used to allow the use of new technologies and new standards. I heard the first bell, so let me quickly then wind up. Gas flaring is a waste of resources, and when we go into the Arctic, we should not repeat the heavy gas flaring that takes place other places in the world. There are methods to use the gas close to the source or to export it so that we don't have the black soot problems on the ice from the flaring. In the Barents Sea, on the northern sector of the Barents Sea, Norwegian sector, we have not yet seen negative impact on the sea. We see low probability of accidents, but we see further need for investments in oil spill contingency plans. This is my last slide. In our company, we also studied on behalf of the OG21, which 11 new technology areas we recommend to move the oil and gas operations forward. And these are available in the report that you can access with the address that is up there, and which I hope the organizer will make publicly available after this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Moving along to Professor Johnston from University of Akureyri and University of Greenland, please.
Kuyanak, Your Excellency, distinguished guests. Unfortunately, my immune system hasn't taken much of a liking to spring, so I hope you can hear me clearly enough. My purpose in speaking this afternoon is to introduce the new Arctic Oil and Gas Research Centre that we established at the University of Greenland in March this year, and to invite you to contact us with ideas for research activities. We aim very much to be responsive to your suggestions as we develop our research agenda. What do you think needs more investigation? What do you want to know more about? There's no point repeating research that's already been done, but there's also little benefit in research that is purely academic in a pejorative sense, but doesn't have meaning or impact on development decision-making. So first, I'd like to take a moment to explain our logo. It was designed by local artist Eva Lurisige. Does this work? There we go. Sorry, shouldn't have done that. It's inspired by the logo of Elysium Mutisarfik, which features the traditional women's boats. And you can see the traditional Inuit dolls, which are reflected in the water. The dolls symbolize the contemporary view of nature derived from traditional Inuit culture. It's a deliberate choice to place the human forms in the center of the logo, as they are the key to our research. Oil and gas is found under the sea, but also in the mountains, so the dolls on the icebergs are seen to drip like oil, and the blue color indicates the Arctic emphasis of our work. Anne Merrill Henson and I are co-directors of the center. Anne came to Greenland with her father as a young child and lived in Aleutsupa and Nosak, and later went to gymnasium in Katortork. This is her with her sisters in South Greenland. Anne has a master's in engineering from Aalborg University and then returned to work in the southern municipality, Kommune-Kujalleq, for 6 years. She wrote her PhD on strategic environmental impact assessment in Greenland. And aside from her position as professor at Illis-Mutisarfik and director of the center, Anne is associate professor at Aalborg University. Anne can't be with us today as she's currently in Alaska as part of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative program, through which she obtained a research scholarship. She's working on the project Adaptation Actions for a Changing Arctic in the Baffin Bay Davis Strait for the Arctic Council. Anne is an expert on environmental impact assessment processes and tries to find ways of making the participation of communities more meaningful. I'm an Icelander of Scottish origin, married to an Italian, now working in Greenland because it wasn't cold enough. I studied at the University of Glasgow, the European Academy of Legal Theory in Brussels, University of Toronto, and then the University of Akureyri. I'm Professor of Law at Illis-Mutisarfik and at University of Akureyri. In recent years, I've been focusing on international law in the Arctic, and last year I published a monograph on offshore oil and gas development. That book examines the necessary criteria for hydrocarbon activities to be compatible with international environmental law, human rights law, and the rights of Indigenous peoples. And it also tries to answer the question, what happens if we get it wrong? Anne and I make an interesting, but I hope productive team, and our research interests complement one another. Anne is the social scientist, extensive fieldwork experience, especially in Greenland. I'm more bookish, not so comfortable away from my desk, and that's why Anne is taking me around Greenland, first on a boat to South Greenland this coming December, and then next year to East Greenland and North Greenland. It's very important to both of us that we hear different perspectives from different parts of the country, and not just from those of you who can manage to come to Nuuk. We also hope to use our trips to talk to people about the work we're doing and present our results. Anne and I are supported in the centre with two other experienced researchers from the university, Bjørn Poppel and Mark Nuttall. They're going to advise us and help us hone our research agenda. So our work is focused on the social and economic impacts of hydrocarbons. We're not geologists, we're not engineers, though we may at times consult with geologists and engineers to get a better understanding of the science behind the hydrocarbon business. We're interested in trying to make those social and economic impacts as positive as possible for communities, and in trying to avoid some of the mistakes that have been made elsewhere. Greenland's not the first country in the world to try to exploit hydrocarbons, but it does face unique challenges as a result of geography, climate, and demographics. Although based here in Greenland, we know there's a lot to learn from other Arctic communities, and also a lot that Greenlandic experience can teach. We'll therefore be looking at hydrocarbon developments elsewhere in the Arctic and working with an international team of researchers. We want to develop our research in collaboration with all kinds of stakeholders, not just here in Nuuk, but around Greenland, hence our travel plans. We want to hear from representatives of Indigenous peoples, other local communities, governments, oil and gas companies, and NGOs. And it's important our results are accessible. Peer-reviewed journals and book chapters remain the mainstay of academic life and are still the best signal of quality. However, this area is of great political, social, economic, and practical significance, and it's essential that the outcomes of research activities are disseminated widely to all stakeholders, far beyond the traditional academic audience. And therefore, everything we work with will produce a short briefing note in ordinary language to explain our main findings to a wider audience. We'll also present our work in different fora, from formal conferences like this one, to town hall sessions and private meetings with interested parties. The first briefing note's available outside. I just explained the establishment of the centre. Unfortunately, the Greenlandic version has not quite yet been translated, but I do expect it in the next couple of days. Above all, we want our research to have a practical component and aim to make practical recommendations for policymakers. We don't want to just describe existing processes and legal frameworks, we want to make those better. So having said that we will consult and develop our research in collaboration, we do have some preliminary ideas of research. This is not an exhaustive list, and I don't think there's any need to read it, but it can give you an idea of what we have in mind. I encourage all of you interested in the topic to come to me with more ideas for research. So you can read more about us on our website in Greenlandic, Danish, and English. And if you scroll down on the left in any of the 3 sites, you can find the latest news about our activities and our publications. You can also see on the website when Anne and I are available in Nuuk or elsewhere in Greenland and arrange meetings. And of course, we're always available to correspond by email. So, thank you. Kuyana.
And moving on now to the next speaker, Alexander Shestakov from World Wildlife Foundation.
Добрый день. Большое спасибо за приглашение. Очень приятно быть опять в Гренландии, в Нуке. Don't expect translation. I just try another language, which is pretty common in the Arctic. So maybe next time will be a translation there. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here again. Thanks for organizers. It's the first time when I attend the regional session of the Arctic Circle, but attended with a great interest and definitely extremely useful assemblies. I'm looking forward for the new one in October. Just to start talking about some of WWF vision for what is sustainable development in the Arctic. So what kind of principles need to be implemented if you like to have sustainable development of natural resources, but also clearly saying that as a conservation organization, WWF is not against development. WWF is very much supportive of development. The question is what kind of development? And how is this development going on? What are the results of development, and who can actually share the benefits of this development? To start, I'd just like to say a little bit about challenges. And again, as many other speakers said, challenges, opportunities are always coming together. And many of those challenges, which we also can articulate maybe as some deficits in the Arctic, they can be probably translated into some opportunities. Even easy resources which are not available in the Arctic may be a little bit easier if climate will help. So there was a lot of discussion about infrastructure and what can be done there, definitely on new technologies and innovations to come to the Arctic to fix some of those issues. But strategic assessment, that's what is missing. That was not really covered during those 1.5 days, unfortunately. But strategic assessment also requires strategic vision for the Arctic and strategic vision for different regions of the Arctic, as well as strategic vision for development. That's, frankly speaking, I'm a little bit missing after this 1.5 days. I heard a lot about strategies for development of particular sectors, but I am missing actually the comprehensive picture for the Arctic, how all this come together. Even a very simple example from the previous session around airlines, development and availability of hotels and rooms for tourists. That's a very minor example, but there are many more, including how all programs for mineral resource development is basically come together with any other parts of the discussion for the development. Knowledge, and I specifically mentioned here knowledge because we're definitely talking about traditional knowledge and science and knowledge generated by business, knowledge generated by companies and not always fully shared with the rest of the society. So all these pieces need to come together. Stability and predictability in the Arctic. I think I enjoy very much, Anders, your intervention yesterday when you said this word stability doesn't exist in Sami language. That's exactly describe how the Arctic is today and what we will face tomorrow and how we can address it if we are not taking a really strategic visionary approach for the Arctic. WWF has relatively simple vision for 2050, as well as our overarching goal for 2020. I think few elements are very important. So the one is that what we are working for in terms of conservation is basically for keeping healthy living systems in long term, but those healthy living systems, they are actually for the benefit of local people, but also for all humanity. And another part of the equation is not to follow scenarios. We also heard several different scenarios during last 1.5 days, scenarios based more or less on traditional statistical and data approach. We actually like to see how we all together, everyone, all stakeholders in the Arctic, would like to shape the future of the Arctic, not just follow some potential scenarios which may happen because of different reasons, maybe 5%, maybe 9%, actually what percentage we want to have. So what is our target for the Arctic for 2050, for example? Another part of the equation, I think the only presentation I saw reference to Sustainable Development Goal was yesterday in presentation of our colleague from FAO. But it's a kind of a background. It's not an answer for the question. It's not the answer what we need to do in the Arctic. But it's kind of a background which can help us probably to set better targets. And if we think about those goals, which maybe some people think that those goals are for other parts of the world, but I think that goals related to education, food security, modern energy, isn't that exactly the words we heard so many times yesterday and today? So they're absolutely applicable to the Arctic. But how it's unfolding in the Arctic? What will be indicators, measures for those goals in the Arctic? Do we thinking about complementing national plans for achieving sustainable development goals with a regional Arctic plan? Do we really know the baseline of today, where we are in the Arctic if we like to move forward to sustainable goals? And whether we are ready to monitor the progress to achieve those goals. So maybe we need to do some work when we actually can unfold what sustainable development goals means in the Arctic and whether they can be used to inform what kind of development we like to have, but then also what kind of investments we like to have in the Arctic. Informed decisions. We definitely were discussing a lot that decisions about the future of the Arctic need to be really well informed, but also they need to be based on a broad participation on stakeholders. Knowledge was mentioned several times. Again, all sort of knowledge, which despite the fact, I agree with a colleague from DNV, we have a lot, still not enough. And maybe we'll never enough. That's also we need to be absolutely clear when we make our decisions. Sometimes we probably don't need necessarily to wait until the whole knowledge is in place. But then, of course, precautionary approach will help us. Inclusive decisions, that's another important part, because many decisions in the Arctic will be societal choice. And very often it's not necessarily need to be something or something. Even for Greenland, I think there are still debates in a Nuuk area. So what is better, to have whaling in a Nuuk fjord or a whale watching in a Nuuk fjord? I don't think it's or. So we definitely need to think how those things can be combined. But that again requires strategic approach, strategic assessment, and strategic vision for that. Whether we have a standard for operations in the Arctic which are going beyond simple compliance, that are actually based on best available technologies and best available practices. And the word compliance continue to be important, but probably should be finally secondary because we like to be better than compliance. What type of development we like to see in the Arctic in an era of climate change? From our perspective, it needs to be low carbon or actually better carbon neutral development. And those types of development need to be supported. And those type of investments need to be prioritized in the Arctic if you really like to go the right way, and also present the example of the Arctic, which is pretty unique for the rest of the world. And we have a fantastic chance, basically, to do that, and to show the rest of the world how the huge, complicated region can be basically managed in a proper way. From our perspective, to get there, we definitely need to formulate the vision. So I was really excited to hear the first day from the chair of ICC, the need for 2050 vision. That's exactly what we're thinking about. And this vision needs to be based on targets and objectives. We really need to know and decide collectively. And by the way, from my perspective, the Arctic Circle is probably absolutely perfect platform to work together, bringing all stakeholders basically to discuss where we like to be in 2050 with the Arctic. Not just allow to be fatalic, where we go one another way, where the oil price will be 50 or 25 or 120. So but basically set where we like to be, and then work collectively to be there by 2050, and know how to address it, how to measure it, and actually put some time frame for it. There are many elements of this vision, how we can be there. So I think that only few are mentioned here. And again, I completely agree with colleagues that the hybrid decisions, that's probably what we need. There is no single silver bullet there to achieve it. But again, working collectively and thinking more strategically about the Arctic, whether it's coming for the entire region, whether it's coming to a particular country or sub-region of the Arctic, that's the way forward. That's what we are missing. And that's not really contradict with the point that we also need to use opportunities which are raised today. But those opportunities need to be somehow within this context. They need to be part of strategic approach, but also part of the strategic assessments which we are missing. And then, of course, we need to have an adaptive governance for that. And that requires common efforts. And we're also happy to see that the Arctic Council is evolving towards this direction, which is definitely a positive move. So thank you very much. And thanks a lot for Greenland, because every time I come here, it's really cold country. So, but what I always feel, I feel really warm, because the people here are really welcoming us so warm, so nice, that every time coming to Nuuk and to other parts of Greenland is a real pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Alexander Sheskakov. And now to the last speaker of today's session, or this session, Jon Palmason from Verkis, please.
Ministers of Greenland, Iceland President, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I will start to tell you about first time I come to Greenland. I really fall in love with Greenland. I like it so much, and then I have been here 4 times every year to Greenland, and every time it's exciting. I will now talk about projects a little bit more practical than the other here today. Our mission in Verkis is to make an approach to successful project consisting of work in close collaboration with the clients. It's the most important that we are very connected to the client and the local community in the place. And all the other that it's involved in the project we are running. We are qualified in ISO standards and environmental standards and health and safety standards. one of the things is that Verkís have been a leading company in environment and social impact assessment and planning. We are working, providing global and local experience to the technical know-how, and together with the customer, we are able to provide a service of doing environment and social impact. What is the social impact, environmental and social impact? It is really that you write up all the things that new project can involve, can have impact on environment, on social life. And you write it down and you find out, is it acceptable or not? And shall we do something to fix it? We have been running projects wide in the world. We have about 300 employees in Iceland. 78% are with university degrees. Our turnover outside Iceland is about 30%. We are represented in Greenland. We, in 2014, merged with SOM Verkís, SOM company in Greenland. And we have there about 8 employees, and they are mostly Greenlanders. There's mostly only one from Iceland, and all the other are Greenlanders. The main projects are buildings, infrastructure, and energy. Here you can see it is in the town. What is the difference? What is the things we have in the Arctic? We have a population that is scattered over a wide area. There is a long distance between every people, everywhere. The degree of education is high compared to other parts of the world. Maybe it is better somewhere than the other places, but it is really high. We are rich on nature. Especially in Greenland, we have natural resources, minerals. We have also the nature for the tourists, and we have a nature for the hydropower and other power things. But it is the nature is dangerous. It is dangerous to come out to the nature. I can tell you, when I was young, my dad is a farmer in the North Country. I started to drive around in the farm, and my father say, be careful, because everything you damage, it takes a very long time to recover. Because the grass is long time on growing, everything is a long time recovering in these areas. It is the main thing with, when we start a new project, is that we have to be careful of the nature. We have, in Iceland, we have done a lot of hydropower plants. Here is some few of the hydropower plants we have done recently. And we have also done a geothermal power plants. And we have also been involved in an industry plant in Iceland. In all these plants, we have sometimes done this environmental and social impact assessment, this one. And we can see that we have an experience of this in the Icelandic area. And here in Greenland, we have done we have been designing a latest hydropower plant in Greenland to get, as a consultant for Ístak. That was the builder. And again, to the environmental issue. ESA is a systematic process identified. It is easier to say it, like I said before. The environmental performance or focus or point in every project and enhanced by environmental creditors and reputants. And the things is that all of these things is to write down what is the issue, what is the impact of the nature, and find out what we can change, what is not change to back when we have left if we make a power plant or and we have to take it down, what we have to do to minimize impact of the nature. The objectives of environmental impacts assessment in the Arctic cannot be met without paying attention to the special features of the area. All these things is very important, that the breakdown time and that all these things are very important. Yeah. And the most important is also that we have people in this area, and normally we have a very few people. When we did the impact study on social impact study for the aluminum smelter in East Iceland, we did a very long study of the population in the area, because there was only living about 4,000 people. And I can say that after this plant have been in the running for, I think, 6 or 8 years, first now the society is being stable again. Then I will talk a little bit about the road from an idea for the project until you got a new industry. First thing you do is somehow a pre-feasibility study. You study the cost of everything, and you find out, is it a project? Is it something we can do? And then, if you do that, then you do the feasibility study. Then you make a more design, pre-design of the things, both the plant and the energy you have to build up, energy production you have to build up. And then you make the environmental and social impact assessment. But then you have the milestone where you have to make the decision. Sometimes the milestone is too big, then you cannot pass the decision. But hopefully, in the most cases, you can make the decision and continue, and then you can construct a design and make the procurement and then implement the new plant for you. And then I thank you for this one, and thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah. I think time is speeding along very quickly, so we have to move on. I believe due to time, we only have time for one question. Am I correct? with the timekeepers? Yes. So regrettably, we only have time for one brief question. And please, if you have a question, you're welcome to stand up and direct your question at one of our speakers at the panel, please.
Thanks. Paige Wilson,
Madam, yes?
Ilisi Matusafik, University of Greenland. And my question is for John Mayer. We've heard here from other panels about the challenges of local recruitment here in Greenland, and I'd be interested to know what proportion of your employees are drawn from the local population. Thanks.
Yeah.
Really, over the last 8 years or so, our sort of workforce has ebbed and flowed depending on what phase of the evaluation process we're working through. And at times we've had workforces in the evaluation phase of say, 30 or 40 in South Greenland that are really dealing with a cross-section of activities from drilling to environmental surveys to camp management and logistics and so forth. At times they've been, I guess, international workforces, but at points I would say that probably about 50% during those activities have been from the local populace of Narsaq. And we looked to steadily increase that around those activities. We brought in initiatives where we would bring in foreign, for example, drill foremen from Canada and train up the local populace or local employees. And then we would work with the mining school such that when we weren't active, the employees could actually go and develop further skills and language competency and so forth in the mining school. And we introduced a concept of traineeships whereby we could continue to develop skills and actually got to the point where we had standalone Greenlandic drill teams and so forth. So it's something that takes a strategy, if you like, because it doesn't happen overnight. But clearly what we learnt is that there was a lot of interest in participation, there was interest in developing the skills, and there was, I think, a level of increased confidence just from the involvement. So I think to answer your question, it really depends what phase of the operation you're really in. But in each case, the aim is to try and have local participation and increase competency and confidence around the skills that are available.
All right, I think that was very brief, so perhaps we have time for a very brief, short question. One more. Have a Sarah Olsvik.
Thank you. Of course, it's difficult to make it brief when there's so many issues on the agenda. I had a question to the Ilisi Matusafik. Why not also focus on other issues than oil and gas in regards to industrial development? And then I have a question to the Greenland government. Wouldn't it be a good idea to say loudly that there's an opposition to uranium mining at a conference like this? I noticed yesterday that it was part of the introductory video, and also in the speech by the Minister for Mineral Resources, there was some emphasis on trying to make a broad consensus on development. And we clearly have a problem in regards to consensus making, in regards to specifically uranium, even though there's no one, as far as I know, that is against industrial development or mineral resource development. And then lastly, to the Greenland Minerals and Energy, how do you see, from your point of view, the opposition to uranium, and how do you address that in your work, in your everyday life? You are active in Narsaq and know, and just look at the street, you can see that a large number of Greenlanders are opposing to uranium mining. And how does that look from your point of view? Thank you.
Well, that was 3 questions, but I think we can answer it quite.
Thank you for that. That's a really good question. Our centre is oil and gas. Anna and I are experts in oil and gas. That's what we do, and that's what we're paid to do. But in our broader research network and in our cooperation, we'll certainly be working with people with experience in mineral development, for example, looking at how that's been integrated compatibly with the reindeer, for example, in Lapland, and as well as how mineral development has operated in Canada. And in fact, Bea Poppel and Mark Nuttall, our colleagues, members of the Centre, have a wider experience also in those areas. So our broader research will certainly work together with other experts in those areas so we can take a broader approach.
Thank you. And on to the Minister.
Thank you. I think it's appropriate that since I'm representing the government of Greenland, that I present the policies of the government. I'm not here to present the parliament or the opposition.